Hello and welcome to Right Talk Wednesday. I'm your host, Kit Kalestow, and this week I am very excited to chat with pagan author and creator Laura Perry. Laura Perry is a pagan creator who works with words, paint, ink, music, textiles, and her herbs, and she works magic with all of that. She's the founder and temple mom of Ariadne's tribe, a worldwide inclusive Minoan spirituality tradition, and has written several nonfiction and fiction books featuring Minoan culture, Minoan history, Minoan spirituality. And we're going to talk about those throughout the interview. So I will let her tell you about those. When she's not busy drawing, writing, or leading rituals or workshops, she likes to dig in the vegetable and herb garden or give a living history demonstration. And both of those things sound wonderful. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Is there anything, I figured we'd give the titles of the books as we talked about them.
Mhm.
But is there anything else that maybe I left out of your biography or anything you'd like to share with our listeners before we start?
I'm a writer and an artist. I mean, you pretty much covered it.
Okay. Well, great. So what I have seen your works in the pagan circles, and my first thought has always been, oh, that sounds so cool. And that's also a culture and a spirituality. I don't think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think a lot of people write about Minoan culture specifically.
Yeah, they don't. In fact, a big part of the reason that I wrote the books I did is because there weren't resources out there. I think a lot of authors in the pagan community and outside of it, they want resources and they go looking and they can't find something, so they have to create it themselves. So that's how a lot of stuff ends up out there, is because we want it and it doesn't already exist. And so our only recourse is to create it. So,
I'm guilty. Yep. One of the first books I published, I haven't published anything nonfiction in a while, but one of the first books I published back in the day was one of the first books on animal Reiki.
oh wow.
Yeah, back in the day, back in the olden days. We and yeah, you're 100% correct. The publisher I was with had a call for submissions for metaphysical books. And I went, well, I'm starting to see all these books on Reiki, but none dealing with animals. Let me go write that. So you are 100% correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so if I can ask, and it's okay to not answer, but if I can ask, was what brought you into interest in Minoan spirituality and culture?
Um, well, the inciting event, I guess you could call it, was an art history class in high school. We had this enormous book. For anyone who's old enough to know what an unabridged dictionary looks like, that's how big this art history book was. Yeah, yeah, it was intimidating. It was the first time I had ever had a giant textbook like that for a class. And so I was just dreading the class. And then one of the days during the very first week, the teacher sat us down and had us open the books. And it turns out there were these big sections of full color plates, glossy full color plates in this book. So turns out I still have the book. It was an awesome text. And so he just started kind of moving us through those images from cave art forward. And so we were flipping pages, looking at this beautiful ancient art, and I turned the page, and there was the Bull Leaper fresco, and I just went head to toe goosebumps. Just
Oh, wow.
absolutely, yeah. And this was back in the pre-internet days, so finding anything about the Minoans back then was just like pulling teeth. There were like two paragraphs in the encyclopedia. There were no books out there. There was no internet. So I scrounged every little scrap I could. It became an obsession. I drew Minoan style art, just like doodling in the margins of my notes in school, in high school and college. I scrounged every scrap of information I could get. And then in the 90s, there was a sort of boom in archaeology. A lot of people don't realize the Minoan sites are all still being excavated. This is ongoing work. Even Knossos, they're still digging and still finding new things. They're even finding new sites all the time. And so suddenly there were books available. And then once the internet became a thing, there was information out there. And so when I started getting really serious about my spiritual path, those deities were already there tapping me on the shoulder saying, hey, you have some work to do. So yeah, my first book was actually I was in a Wiccan coven at the time, and I was working on my second degree, and I was given an assignment to pick any pantheon I wanted, and to write a year's worth of seasonal rituals and a lifetime's worth of rites of passage.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, yeah, that was pretty major. And I was thinking, oh, I'm going to do like one of the Celtic, Irish or Welsh pantheons, or maybe Egyptian. And the whole time the Minoan deities were there going, hey, excuse me. So I took the hint. And so that collection of rituals eventually became my book, Ariadne's Thread, which was the first Minoan, the first edition of it was the first Minoan themed book I published. So
Wonderful. That just, I could just feel your emotion through the screen here. The
yeah.
the love for that touches my heart. That's such a wonderful, wonderful story. And I know, there are times when the deities kind of poke you really hard, and then there's also times when they're like, "Come here, I got something to show you." And those
Yeah.
times I think are the most special because it
Yeah.
touches you. Yeah. How wonderful. So it looks like for nonfiction, you have Ariadne's Thread, and then is it Labrys and Horns?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I published Ariadne's Thread in 2013. The first edition was a Moon Books title. Moon Books, they're a great publisher. I highly recommend them. Um, and then, but that was before Ariadne's Tribe existed. So I wrote the book and I got it published, and I kind of looked around and went, huh, now what? And the group that I was with at the time, they were very patient with me, but they were not as into the Minoan stuff as I was. And so I started a Facebook group, and I thought, okay, maybe there are like a few dozen people out there who would like to chat about this stuff with me, and we can just like be our own little thing online. I had no idea that there was so much interest specifically in inclusive Minoan spirituality. There have been other Minoan groups around since the 70s, the Minoan Brotherhood, which is specifically for gay and bi men, and the Minoan Sisterhood. Those have been around for a long time, but they have limited membership. And I wanted a group that included everybody. And so, yeah, people just kind of first slowly and then a lot faster started just kind of finding their way to the Facebook group. And eventually, as a community, we figured out what we wanted to do in terms of spiritual path, how we wanted to set up like a sacred calendar. And we explored the pantheon and dug around and found all these deities. And so that was very much a community effort. I'm like the project manager, but I'm not the one who, it's not all me. Okay. And so after we had done all of that work, we had this collection of information in the Facebook group, and several people said, hey, you write books, right? How about you put this into a book so that we don't have to keep searching through the archives of the Facebook group when we want to figure out how to do something? And so that was Labrys and Horns. So Labrys and Horns is really the official like introductory how-to book for Ariadne's tribe spirituality. So it's a sacred calendar, the pantheon, the ecstatic postures, our basic practices, the things that we share. But yeah, that was another one of those sort of, there's no resource out there, so we have to make it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow. Well, that's great. And of course, for the listeners, all of the links will be in the show notes, so they'll be available to click on and purchase to your heart's content, which I'm sure nobody will mind at all. And it looks like too that you haven't limited your nonfiction work to just um talking about the Minoans, although there's a coloring book and there's also a tarot deck. And I've seen images of that tarot deck online, and I have thought that was extremely beautiful. There's also a Wiccan Wellness Book and Ancient Spellcraft. Were
yeah.
those written before or after the Minoan work?
Those were before Ancient Spellcraft. The first edition of Ancient Spellcraft was my very first book. That was back in 2001. And then the first edition of the Wiccan Wellness Book was in 2003. And so that was really my introduction. Those were conventionally published. So that was really my introduction to being a pagan writer. And those came about because I had a friend who was working for the publisher, and she was scouting for more writers and knew that I wrote. And so yeah, Ancient Spellcraft, it turns out when I went back to revise it for the second edition, I went and counted, and it turns out that like a fourth of the spells in there are actually Minoan themed. So it was already there when I didn't even realize it. So yeah, it
That's cool
seeps
though.
in. It seeps in when you're not looking.
Yeah, and you had listed too. You had written. I recognize quite a few of those publications. Sadly, so many of them aren't around anymore. Um, but it looks like you've written for the Magical Times and SageWoman and Pagan Dawn and quite a few magazines. And I know when I got started writing for pagan magazines in like the mid 90s, there was quite a few, or there was quite I don't
Yeah.
think people quite understand in this internet age just how many little zines and little magazines there really
Yes.
were.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I still have a stack of physical copies of
Hmm.
Sage Woman and Witches and Pagans and Magical Times. Um, yeah, most of them continued to exist up until the pandemic hit, and then during the lockdown, I noticed a lot of them folded, which is
Yep.
really sad. Um, because they were such great resources for the community. They were a great way to hear a lot of different voices.
Hmm.
So yeah, and what does still exist has mostly gone online. Although I will say, uh, Sage Woman and Witches and Pagans still have print copies that you can subscribe to. But
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. I,
the
I look at those for
the landscape has changed.
very, very much so. I went, I can't remember. Oh, it was my CV. I was like, why was I listing all my publications? I was creating my CV for the end of my undergrad, just well, it was just a year ago. And I started listing them all out, and I ended up down the wormhole of trying to figure out what happened to the Wiccan Pagan Press Alliance.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And
Oh
the
wow.
last I could tell, um, I think it was Silver Ravenwolf was like the leader of it. And then about 2017 or whatever, I was the last reference I ever found online. And I could never connect to what happened to that. But yeah, it sounds like you recognize that.
Yeah. I mean, it takes so much labor, so much time and
Mhm.
effort, and so many resources to run any of those publications or organizations that, it is often a strain on the people who are doing it. And so
So much so.
I'm usually pretty amazed when they last as long as they do because it's just so much work.
Yeah, I think the moral of that story is, especially in this age where we're all so fractured, is if somebody has a Patreon, if somebody has a Ko-fi,
Yes.
even $3 to $5 a month,
Yep.
obviously more is better, but if you can give them even a couple of dollars a month, that may be what keeps things going. So yeah, just support
Yes.
people wherever possible, directly wherever possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about something happier. Let's
Okay.
let's move to fiction because one of the things I'm passionate about, we talked a little bit about this before I started the podcast, was I love it when authors combine what they're interested in or what they're passionate about in both fiction and nonfiction. And so and what really caught my attention is you have written a Minoan historical gay male romance, and that's what I write.
Yes.
So I tell me more.
Well, so I've written two Minoan themed novels, and they are both inspired by past life memories. Um, and Leap is the gay romance, and it is the happy one of the two. Last Priestess of Malia is not a happy story because it's about the end of Minoan culture. Um, but yeah, I had this set of sort of past life memories in my head, and I thought, this sounds like a story. This sounds like the kind of story I would like to share with somebody. And I started writing it down, and it's set in Festos, which is the second largest Minoan city. It's in the south of Crete, and it is set among the bull leapers, which is a perennial favorite topic for people who are interested in the Minoans. Um, so yeah, I wrote it. I wrote The Last Priestess of Malia first, and I felt like I had to tell that story so that people could understand what happened to the Minoans. But it was such a weighty story that after that I wanted, I guess you might call it a palate cleanser. I wanted something more uplifting. And so Leap is, I mean, there's angst, it is a romance. There are difficulties and misunderstandings and all of that, but it has a happy ending. I needed that happy ending, um, just for myself. When I was doing the writing, I've never been the kind of person who could like study the market and write to market. That's not, um, I mean, I know people who do it and who do it well and who enjoy it, but it's not something that I could enjoy. Um, So I looked at the story and said, okay, what genre is this story really? And oh gosh, it's a gay romance. Okay, well then I've written a gay romance. Um, so yeah, that's my fiction tends to cross genre boundaries. The uniting concept behind all of it is paganism and magic, and how encountering the divine and the magical within the world changes people.
I
And
love
so,
that. Yeah, I love that. And uh, if anybody who also has listened to the work that I do through Epona Author Solutions, I'm a big proponent of write what moves you. Don't
yeah,
write to market.
yeah.
Um, I remember, I remember when Paranormal Romance, finally they figured out what it was and it was starting to sell. Um, and you could always tell, and this is a hill that I will stand on forever. I could always tell which big names wrote it because their publisher told them to, and which big names were doing it because they loved paranormal and loved science fiction fantasy.
Wow.
And that's just like the topaz sci-fi romances that, yeah, I mean, um, some of them you could tell, oh, all they've done is seen Star Trek. And some of them you're like, oh no, they're into it. They're building the world and the culture. So yeah,
Yeah.
I am a firm believer wherever possible, even if you're aligning it to market, but wherever possible, write what moves you. And I just kind of want to go back and highlight when you were talking about your writing, you said all my writing focuses on the magic of life in one way, either through personal, spiritual, or characters encountering magic and the divine and how they respond to it. And let's talk about that a little bit more because one, I'm a religious studies geek, so that's totally up my alley. And two, I feel like all of our writing in some way is writing about the human condition. And I don't think enough of us write about the magic of being human or the magic that kind of moves us. So just if you feel comfortable, kind of what are you thinking about when you work with that or when you think about that?
Um, I've heard the phrase a lot recently, re-enchanting the world. And I like the idea, but honestly, the world has always been enchanted for me and for most of my pagan friends. So it's not like that's anything new. It's just that people for whom the world is not magical to start with are now beginning to discover that it might be magical. Um, but yeah, there is more than meets the eye to everything. And yeah, my nonfiction is, obviously spiritual practice and all of that, but my all of my fiction tends to start with a question, a what if, and a lot of those questions have to do with how the world works, especially the unseen parts of it, um, and how we respond to that, um, how we accept or deny that that sort of stuff exists, and then what we do with that, how we behave based on those assumptions. Um, so like the main character in Leap has a lot of anger toward a particular goddess, Poseidaya, the sea goddess, because he feels like she took his former lover from him. His former lover died as a sailor at sea, and Adelphos, the main character, has some issues with the ocean to start with due to some childhood trauma, and so he's got all of these emotions so wrapped up in this that he can't see clearly, and he doesn't can't even really identify his own emotions accurately. And that's probably a condition everybody is familiar with. We've all been there, right? Um, and so it takes other people in his life reflecting to him what he's saying and how he's behaving and pointing out to him what his assumptions are before he can see them himself. And of course, the culture is a pagan, polytheist, animist culture that he lives in. And so the assumptions are different from modern Western culture. But there's still, the fact that there's so much that goes on within and around us that we don't see, that we actively choose not to see, um, that we filter in whatever way based on our worldview, and whether that worldview involves deity, whether that worldview involves any kind of magic or energy work or spirits or anything like that. We all we're all sort of a walking collection of preconceived notions. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's good. I like that. That's that's amazing. That's yeah, that's and I think that also goes along. with being creative and us creative people, because something I've found
Yeah.
is that people who write, people who paint, people who do art, play music, there's a different worldview in that you know
Yeah.
whether we're exploring things through our art, but I think there's a different way of looking at it than people who use their gifts in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's like when I was learning to draw and paint, and I had the revelation that nothing is the shape that I think it is and nothing is the color that I think it is. Um, and so I guess that's another example of the filters that we put
Hmm.
on our lives. Um, because like you and I wear eyeglasses. We know what shape those eyeglasses are, right? No, if you try to draw a pair of eyeglasses in the shape that you think they are, it's going to look like a child's drawing, because what you're drawing is the idea of eyeglasses instead of the actual visual of them. And so we all walk around with these ideas of what things are, these ideas of what relationships are, these ideas of what divinity is or what magic is or anything like that. And I mean, there is an extent to which we have to have sort of that summary, in our brain just in order to be able to function on a daily basis. But it's always more complicated than that. So yeah, it there to me there is a sense in which anybody who creates, whether it's writing or art or music or dance or whatever kind of creation you do, if you think about it, creation is a divine act, right? That's what the
Hmm.
gods do. And so it's an as above so below kind of thing. We are doing something divine in our apparently ordinary lives when we create. And I do find it interesting that most people who do creative stuff do it because they feel compelled to. They can't not create. Um, it's like it's not what you do, it's who you are.
Hmm.
So that's like a very foundational part of our being.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. Well, that's amazing. And I feel like that is also like the perfect closure to leave our talk today on. That's just that I think that just kind of brings everything around for full circle and closes that circle. So that this has been lovely, a lovely conversation to have. Um, Before we go, I do want to allow you a chance. Of course, I will post all the links in the show notes, but please do tell listeners, viewers, where they can find out more about you and your work.
Well, my website is the Central Hub, lauraperryauthor.com. And from there, you can find my books, my tarot deck, my socials, my Substack, all of that. There are links to Ariadne's tribe on there too, and the Facebook group. So yeah, that's the easiest first place to go if you're looking for any of that.
Wonderful. LauraPerryAuthor.com.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much again here for being on Right Talk Wednesday. I love having these conversations with other authors and creative people. And so season two here of our podcast, we're going to be talking with a lot of pagan authors and a lot of spiritual authors. And so I can't wait to look and learn more about that side of publishing and kind of reconnect with those roots of my own. So thank you again so much for being here. And everybody listening, I will talk to you next week.